for coming this evening, coming on time, coming looking inspired and ready for today's conversation. Professor Carole Boyce Davies, welcome. Welcome to Kenya, to Nairobi. Karibu Cheche Bookstores, we see. Karibu. Yes. So what I would like us to do, how I'd like us to proceed today, I'm just going to have a bit of a conversation with Professor Boyce for about maybe 40 minutes. Yeah, we could do that. I'll talk to Professor Boyce Davies for about 40 minutes, and then I will spare 30 minutes for you to ask some questions. And tonight we're here really to talk about this book with an absolutely exciting title, The Political Life of a Black Feminist, Black Communist. But what I love about it is Left of Karl Marx. Yeah. So this is the book we're here to talk about tonight. But I know you must have encountered, and I don't know whether somebody has said this to you before, but your book, Gambika, Studies of Women in African Literature, had such a huge impact in academic circles, particularly in the early 90s. And you cannot begin to imagine, and I'm sure you're going to hear it, the kind of work that it inspired, made possible, illuminated, and so on. Yeah. So be prepared to answer a couple of questions from that direction. And anything else really that you've written. I know people read all the time, so they may go beyond this particular book.
Absolutely.
So thank you for being gracious about that. In terms of Kenyan traditions, you know, sometimes, very often when we start an official function, like most countries that have a song, I think every country has a song, yeah? So we have a national anthem, so we usually start with a national anthem. What I wanted to ask you, because we're going to talk a lot about locations, about places, about deportation, about identity. If we were to start with the national anthem, forget about Kenya now, what is the national anthem that would make you most emotional, a sense of affiliation, a sense of, which one would we play?
Wow, that's such a great question. So I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, but I'm telling you that if you asked me to think of a national anthem that would make me feel emotional, it would be Lift Every Voice and Sing, from that famous song by James Weldon Johnson. Yeah. And in almost every circle that you go in the US, in churches and whatever communities, that's the anthem actually. That is the Black national anthem for me. So it would be Lift Every Voice and Sing.
Yeah.
And I don't know, do people know that? Do you know it here? Lift Every Voice and Sing. Please. Till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. Let all voices rise.
So that would be it.
Yeah, that would be it for me, for sure. And at Howard, interestingly, my daughter went to, hi, Tina. When my daughter went to Howard University, I'm working now, and when she came back to home for visits or whatever, we were somewhere where they were playing it just like that, and her instinct automatically, all the Howard students, when they hear that, they put the fist up. Yeah. So it accompanies that. So just want to say that.
Yeah. So Claudia Jones.
I know.
Why her? Why her?
Oh, God.
And I realize you've done a lot of work on this particular woman. How did that happen? Because I always associated your name with studies of women in African literature, and then this.
Yeah. It was amazing. It's one of those things that evolved. And I have to tell you all that this book is a rock star by itself. It's not me, it's the book. The book itself is a rock star, because this book was published in 2007. And you know, that's quite a long time ago. But now there are many people who are still reading it. I go places where it's like, that's the book everybody has, and so on. So there's some works that we do that have their own life and have their own movement, you know, their own intellectual trajectory and all of that. So that's that book. Mm-hmm. But it's not the book alone, it's this woman. You know, it's like bringing her back to life in a way. And it's a book that evolved. So how did it happen? I was asked, University of Wisconsin, interestingly, no, I did the wrong thing, actually. I want to start by saying, in our culture, and I'm sure you do it here too, we acknowledge a kind of sense of why we got to be in a certain place. And I want to acknowledge Ms. Sherry Mugo here tonight, simply because she was one of my earliest connections with Kenya, African women's literature, and all of those experiences, and she's no longer with us. She lived about 60 miles probably from Ithaca, so we would meet occasionally, and whenever there was an event in Africana Cornell, she would, and we needed her to speak or something. Sometimes at the last minute she would come. So I want to use this moment to just reflect and say I want to acknowledge her energy, her presence, and that I'm in her space. So Ms. Sherry, this is for you, and I want to say that proudly as well for you in the audience to know that that's how I feel about being here. And then I have to thank my colleague Makoma, actually, who was the person who's made sure that my visit here for the Safal Swahili Prize, Safal Cornell Swahili Prize, on which I'm the board. And I was happily able to go to Tanzania last year for the same reason, but this year he's really made sure that I was able to see community and encounter people, and I thank Makoma, my colleague, for that, my brother and colleague. But Claudia, I was asked at the university, thank you. Yeah, I was, and I thought of him because University of Wisconsin-Madison. They had some sort of a problem in terms of reaching the black graduate students on black feminist issues. So University of Wisconsin-Madison invited me and a number of people who were doing black feminist work to come to campus and do like a, every week they would have another person, a series of seminars. So they invited people like Bell Hooks, Deborah McDowell, some of the names you know. And I said to myself that if I'm going to do something like that, I can't repeat what Bell Hooks and the others are doing. I need to do something Caribbean. And I began then looking for who would be the Caribbean feminist equivalent that I could talk about, and could not find much of anything on her, which was so amazing. Interestingly, in something like 1985, I had gone to Oxford University to do a kind of summer course at Jesus College as a professor doing black writing, African-American black diaspora writing. And after being there for the time that we were there, 3-4 weeks, we went to Birmingham to visit a friend who was in residence, actually Carolyn Cooper from Jamaica. And Buzz Johnson, a young publisher then, had a small book that was titled, I Think of My Mother, Notes on the Life and Times of Claudia Jones. And at that time, I was one of those young people, very militantly black feminist and stuff. And he told me, well, if all of you who are claiming all this black feminist stuff, you need to know who this woman is. So I bought the book, he was selling them, I bought the book from him. But it stayed on my shelf, and I would use bits and pieces every time I was teaching, and I would pull out a piece and use it. But then when I was asked to do this thing at Wisconsin, I said, let me see what research is available on her that I could use to talk about, and I couldn't. So that was the genesis of the book. And at that time, there was just maybe one encyclopedia entry by Robin Kelly, another piece by a friend, Marxist friend of mine named John McClendon, and this is in the Schomburg Library in New York, and nothing else available. So I began trying to figure out who was this woman. Driven by the fact, remember I started by saying I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, driven by the fact that this was a Trinidadian, I didn't know about her. And I say this because I've talked at Muranga and at Kenyatta yesterday, and we talked about Pan-Africanism. We call the names, generally we call them men. So you all will know all the names of the men that I can call. If I said Padmore, you know Sylvester Williams, C.L.R. James, Stokely and so on. But there's no sense then in which we know any of the women. So I had done the kind of work that you talked about in Nambika, looking at where women's places were in African literature, because trained at Ibadan, proudly, University of Ibadan in African literature, and then coming back to work after that in Trinidad first and then in the United States, there was a sense that if you were teaching African literature, you were still teaching mostly male writers. And so Achebe, everybody, Quincy Schenck and so on. So then after all of that, we began to raise questions, because at the same time there was a black feminist movement taking place, looking at where black women's writing in the United States existed and defining theoretically some of the parameters for that. So some of us who ended up teaching those subjects would, in terms of black feminist writing, were not comfortable just doing the U.S. African-American cohort of writers, and decided to make sure that we brought in people like Amata Aidu, you know, and the others, Rebecca and Jao from here and so on, and make sure they were part of whatever you were doing in terms of that teaching. So the logic was that it's a kind of conjunction, and I was telling the students at Moringa 2 days ago that we were fortunate, some of us, to be at a point, intellectual point of conjunctures, as C.L.R. James would call them, where a lot of intellectual things were happening which would bridge to the other things. And the way the conjuncture works for C.L.R. is that you have these conjunctions of moments, historical moments, which push intellectually a whole host of other movements that then elaborate other ways in which one can define and redefine what one is doing. So my conjunction then would be the Black Power movement in the US with Black aesthetics, Black arts movement, and all of that as a young undergraduate, as I was leaving college, running into African literature, getting trained then in Africans writing, and then the women's movement, and then you realize women are not really represented. So all of those pieces come together. So for the Caribbean, the same thing. You're doing Caribbean literature, if any of you know those fields, but then who are the people, who is the canon or who is the group of writers that you would study?
George Lamming.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or Derek Walcott, and so on. Yeah. So you have to then find a place to who are the women. And one of the things I said in the companion book, as it were, out to Nambika, which is called Out of the Kumbla, Caribbean Women in Literature, was that I wanted to know who were the equivalent Caribbean intellectual thinkers, and she is that person for me. So that's the longest genesis of a book like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds to me, I mean, we often say in academia, you know, there's a gap there that you're trying to fill, but this is more than a gap. This sounds to me like deliberate erasure of the work of a particular woman. And I look at, you know, the way in this book you've positioned her. Just tell me about how the title came to you, Left of Karl Marx, because it seems to me there's a lot of layers of meaning and positioning happening there.
Right. So after not finding any material on her and beginning to do the research, and knowing that her last residence was in London, but the backstory, those of you who've read the work know that she comes to the United States via that first wave of Caribbean migrations in something like 1924, 1920s, post-Panama Canal. You would have the first wave of Caribbean migrations to the United States.
So she's a child at this point?
She is, yeah. She is 8 turning 9 at that time, and comes to what is Harlem, right? But comes, you know, our people who are migrating always thinking they're going to a better life, a better world, and so on. She goes to Harlem and enters what? Hardcore US racism, right?
Yeah.
And she's right then landing in the middle of racism and in the middle of economic depression, right? Because you're going to have the Great Depression coming in at that same time, right? So she enters into the United States and then has to contend with what it means to be a black subject in the United States. She gets ill. She goes through treatments at the sanitarium. She's away for a while at the sanatorium. She has rheumatic fever, which gives her a heart condition, which would plague her for the rest of her life. And then she graduates from high school. And in that same period, you're having things like the Scottsboro Boys murder trials. And I don't know how many of you knew about, but it's equivalent of the Central Park,
5.
now exonerated 5, where you have a group of 9 young men who are charged with raping 2 white women in a train boxcar. And of course, it's not true. And they're almost ready to be lynched. And then the Communist Party, the NAACP, has a legal wing, but it doesn't have the might to take it on. It's the Communist Party that does that. So the Communist Party goes down into Scottsboro, Alabama, and they have their lawyers defending the guys. And eventually, in some of the trials, they created a boxcar train and asked the young women to point out where they were, and then asked the boys where they were, and then, of course, they went in the same place and so on. So they would gradually release them, and I mean, that's a whole other story which you would have to really pursue, because they would try and retry them, you know what they do. And then eventually, the Communist Party's lawyers found ways to help them be exonerated, right? At the same time, they were giving these street corner speeches in Harlem, And a lot of the black members of the Communist Party in Harlem would stand at the corners. This was very popular at that time. People like Marcus Garvey and the others would do it. You know, this is how you would spread the word and so on. So she would, as an 18-year-old, leaving high school, 16, 17, 18, would stand listening to these street corner speakers. And she felt the only ones who really gave the analysis that she liked about what the conditions of the black experience were the Communist Party. So gradually she drifted towards them as a whole way of understanding her plight. So she actually says in her autobiography, and I brought this other book, which you don't have probably, but this has a lot of the essays that she wrote. She also has poetry here. It's published by a publisher in London named Iabea. It has short stories, it has her little not short stories, reflections, and then of course many essays that she wrote, political essays and autobiographical reflections. So it's called Beyond Containment. And the Beyond Containment is another interesting metaphor. You can ask me about why it is that title. But so she goes to London and does a lot of organizing work, gives up. I think I skipped out the other really most important part, that she is the only black woman member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party USA during the McCarthy period, which we're close to having again in the US, is part of that second group of communists that they try, and then they were really brutal to them. Many of them got incarcerated or, sent into exile or deported, and she was one because she was from Trinidad. They didn't know what to do with her because they didn't want to send her back to Trinidad in the middle of all the organizing people were doing in Trinidad at the time. We had labor riots and so on. So they sent her to England. She's a British subject. She, so technically she goes to England, and it's in this English encounter then, I should say, that she, I think, doesn't leave behind her communist positions, but I should say adds to it another layer of relationships in terms of friendships, political connections, and also intellectual understandings. And she creates a West Indian Gazette and Afro-Caribbean News, from which she launches the Caribbean Carnival, and there's all kinds of other things, but becomes more, I would argue, Pan-Africanist in orientation, travels and goes to China, to Russia, and so on, and then comes back after meeting Chairman Mao and others. She dies in London, at the Christmas Eve, they think, in 1964. And her partner, who, when you do interviews in London, people are very upset sometimes when they talk about him because they said he was a Maoist, he was always arguing with her, and they were arguing back and forth about political positions. But I discovered he was the one who insisted that he would bury her Left of Marx.
Fascinating. So, this is where her final resting place is. In a physical sense, she lies left.
Yeah, she stands. And I've had many debates with the Caribbean left guys. They were like, well, maybe she's right of Marx. I was like, as you stand the right hand of Marx. And I always win. I was like, no, as you stand facing the Marx bus, she's left of Marx. And how the title came, let me just finish the question you asked. I was in a forum which included people like Sylvia Wynter at Binghamton, my university where I worked before. I went to 2 other universities, including Cornell. And a student got up after my presentation and said, is it true Claudia Jones is buried next to Marx? And I paused and I said, she's actually buried left of Marx. And Sylvia Wynter said, title.
There, title. It's beautiful, by the way. I'm totally in awe of it, not just because I'm currently writing a book about death and funeral practices in which cemeteries add to my fascination.
Right.
But that positioning for me in terms of ideas, and I'm just thinking in terms of ideas, so she brings, she does actively belong to the Communist Party when she's in the US, and she does engage with ideas even coming from Mao and so on when she's in London. But in terms of the enormity of her contribution, would we be right in saying that she brought something new to the table in terms of not just race, but also gender?
Absolutely. But not only that, a kind of broadened sense of how, in other words, my sense from doing this work is that she reopens Marxism, but in a different place. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's even Marx who said he would not call himself a Marxist, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So she reopens Marxism and what it intended by really bringing forward the question of who is positioned where. And she uses well the position of black women to do that. Mm-hmm. And this is why she is credited with really arguing for a way to understand what she calls a super exploitation of the black woman. Mm-hmm. That the black woman often, and we have so much evidence of that in terms of pay scale, in terms of work and so on, the black woman gives so much more labor mm-hmm. than she's ever recompensed with. Mm. So that essentially all laborers are exploited, but then the black woman becomes another portion of that society whose labor is multiply exploited by others as well. Yeah, including black men, including white women, and so on. So that therefore the ways in which she is, and it explains why black women are so overworked and often overtired and ill and so on, because the amount of labor they put in any context, whether it's organizational work, whether it's wherever, in your workplace and so on, working in people's homes, never equals the level of pay. As you know, the pay scales for black women are so much, always at the bottom, below everybody else's. So what she does then is use the question of domestic labor and the black woman's role to think through how labor exploitation actually works. Yeah. So this is what I mean about reopening Marxism in another way, by putting forward the question of black women. So I don't, I look at her more, not so much as a feminist, but as a kind of black left women's rights activist, because she has written about women, but she never really calls herself a feminist. So
never you wouldn't call her a radical feminist?
I have in my own work, in retrospectively looking back at her, because some positions she took would be definitely equivalent.
And she was able to draw in all of these positions.
Yes, for
and
sure.
just, magnify the layers of oppression.
For sure,
So that imperialism wasn't the only conversation on the table.
But she did use bourgeois feminists as a language.
Okay.
In her,
she just didn't describe herself as a radical feminist.
Not at all.
She did. You said something about when you do interviews in London, and for the benefit of, I know we have many researchers and writers in the house today. I just want you to describe the experience. You're conducting this research for this book. You're interviewing a whole lot of people, and I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes you have contacts who seem very, very pivotal to what you're looking at, and you're looking forward to interviewing them, and and then somehow it never happens. Could you just talk about, as a researcher, as a writer, that emotional, and I'm really interested in method here, but also just that emotional process of you think you have a lead and then you don't.
Yeah.
And then how do you,
How do you pivot around that? Well, in a couple of cases, I started reaching some of the people who were her, colleagues at the time, and that she passed, and almost all of them would be amazingly thankful, and they would tell me, "I am so glad you're doing this." A couple of them cried. Because they said nobody has really spent any time really going back to look at who she was. So for many of them, it was very emotional. And they were able to, some of them handed me things, this is a copy of this is a card she sent me, and so I was able to do that. And a few of them, especially the men, like Billy Strachan, who was an Air Force pilot. And interestingly, I thought they were interesting. These are people who were in the British Air Force, but they were also Communist Party members. And but he was, when I interviewed him about her, he wanted the interview to be about him.
Okay.
So I still have a video. Sadly, he passed a few years ago. And I was thinking, I need to really go back and spend some time hearing it. But it's, these little cassettes you have to find, things to play it and all that. So that was the experience, the men. But also she was very, strikingly attractive and beautiful. So all of them were like so in awe of her, and an amazing speaker. She could captivate a crowd and so on. So the kind of picture they painted of her was of this striking presence in this woman who was like intellectually smart, studying at the same time, and didn't waste time, or didn't, waste time with foolish people. And she ran into a few of them, like she'll be like, I'm not, as we often do. So, yeah.
One thing about academia is that sometimes disciplinarity gets in the way. I don't know that you feel this, but there's a lot of focus on disciplinarity. And in the last chapter of this book, you're talking about the politics of life writing, the studies in the politics of life writing. Where would you place this book? Number one, but number two, also just the whole discourse around life writing in academia. How do you see that? Is it, what's its value?
Such an amazing untapped resource, I should say. There's so many people who need to be written about or known about. And often we don't have their full stories, and we have to sometimes piece it together. That's why I call it piecework. Yeah, it's more like quilting, trying to figure out who these people were. And I mean, you have equivalents here in terms of women who've made those amazing contributions, whose stories are not fully told, right?
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating thing, because to get to Claudia Jones, ironically, the place that had the most information is the FBI file. Yeah, and it's something like 1,000 pages. And that was actually the most sobering part, because you have to write them, and of course after 30 years they had released the stuff. You write them and then send them, and then they send you back another letter telling you how many pages it is, and they will copy it, and therefore it will cost this amount of money, and I think it was like $27 or something. I can't remember how much, because like 5 cents a page or something. Okay. And then when it came, it was like 2 big boxes of stuff, and to go through it is like the whole experience of really understanding how vulnerable you can be. Because in some cases she was just doing a regular meeting or interview, and that's recorded, and there's a page in there on that, So the reason why I bring that up is that they were telling a story about her in their own way, through their informants and whatever. And then to find her story, then you have to figure out what has she written, what has she said about herself, where can you find it, what have other people said about her. So to me, it's that combination. And in a strange way, the FBI files became like a mega resource, it's like a mad librarian, because it's like a lot of it was nonsense, And they would say things like informant, and of course it's the black out the name of who it is, but informant X met her at a meeting place and church, whatever, hall X place in Harlem, and this is what he said about her. And so you have to really find kind of through line in there to really understand her. And then for the women in the room, a lot of what they said early was that she was just writing about black people and women. So essentially the early files, and I mentioned this in here, the early report said subject spent a lot of time talking about black people and women. That was it. So that was the criminal charge. And then there would be another letter in there from Field Marshal, whatever, in the FBI saying, you should probably try to dig a little bit more and get more information. So, so you have these ongoing, discussions about trying to get the agents to uncover more and more information that they could use. So a lot of it is useless information, but a lot of it is valuable too, so you can see what's going on. It makes you think that almost everybody probably has a file somewhere. But in other words, the file is telling the story, but then we have to tell her story in some way and try to find ways that she can be revealed. And that was the most valuable part of it for me, doing that kind of work.
So you're really talking about competing narratives. There's a narrative of the state.
Exactly.
The state has a particular narrative, but then there's also the question of who she is.
Yeah.
Now, she gets imprisoned at some point before she's deported.
Yes.
can we talk about that column? Well, two things. The speech she gave in March 1950 about women's struggles, and if we could talk about that. Are we right to credit her with some positioning as far as the creation of International Women's Day is concerned? But then there was also her column, Half the World. And if you could just talk a little bit about that phrase and the power of it, half the world.
Right. And in my new book, which is out there, Black Women's Rights, I used that half the world logic, because she had started a column about half the world, calling it half the world, in the Daily Worker, the Communist Party organ in New York, calling it half the world, but talking about women and the particular experiences that have to do with women. Now, she was the secretary of the Women's Commission of the Communist Party USA as well at that time, working with a woman named Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was the president. And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is an amazing person as well in her own right. But with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, people have asked me if anybody has done work on that. She traveled to like 48 states in the United States, going around organizing communities of women and so on. So she, in other words, she was doing the work, but at the same time writing about those experiences. And her critique was that the state spends a lot of money, as they usually do, on military weaponry, as the US does and so on, but really doesn't spend money on trying to take care of the essential needs of community and of women and so on. So she did that kind of travel, that kind of work along with it as well. But when she talks about half the world, which I like because it precedes women's, the International Women's, not International Women's Day, the United Nations organizational working around that, where they would actually use that language later on. But she had been using it already in the 1950s,
I see.
Arguing that women represent half the world and therefore do half the world's resources. And I like that because we're often happy when one woman gets a position, and a lot of parties, a lot of organizations love, political groups, governments, I'm sure here too, love to say, well, they have one woman, there's a woman on the board or whatever. But the argument has to be that we need to have 50% representation, that one woman on it doesn't do anything at all. Because as you know, to all of you who have been in organizations and in university board meetings and whatever, if you're the only woman there, you don't really get a chance. You would have to be really the most kind of bitchy person in the world to really get heard. No, because they don't pay you any mind, like they talk over you and all of that, and you have to really...
And they expect you to stand up and serve tea.
Yeah, and then you have to, exactly. Yeah. So it's a big struggle. So you can't really make much headway with just the one representation, the one black in a group, the one...
So away from tokenism to half the world.
I would say, and I really strongly believe that, and I'm advocating that really seriously, that we have to have half, at least close to parity or parity if we want to really talk about any kind of change. Because the few women who end up being visible and represented, often they make a lot of compromises because they're alone and so on. So,
I'm interested in something as, for me as somebody who does some life writing by way of memoirs, by way of sometimes being a ghostwriter, one of the concepts I've really struggled with is that of the hero. And I'm wondering, do you see Claudia Jones as a hero? Is it useful to see her that way? Is, in terms of the things that you have unearthed that she did and wrote and was involved, I mean, she had writing that she was doing while in prison and so just in terms of the volume of stuff that she did, like, is heroism a permanent state of grace? Does it illuminate or does it distract from the immensity of the person? Is it a useful concept?
Wow, that's really nicely put. I don't know. I think heroism often makes you feel like the person ends up being like martyred. I'm thinking, as you would talk, the trivial runs through my head. Tina Turner, we don't need another hero.
We don't need another hero.
Yeah. But the whole idea of heroism to me is really problematic it often sets up that individual person to be the standalone representation out there in front of everybody. And I think what we were saying the other night in conversation actually with some women was that often women organize in different ways. Generally, right? You do have women who want to be that hero as well. But I don't think most of us want to be the hero. We want to be somebody who lives a life of joy, happiness without being oppressed, and being able to live to the fullness of one's capability without really having to stand up and represent the whole group. So,
what's your responsibility when you write about people like that? Is it just to show the greatness? Is it to reflect on the cracks? By reflecting on the cracks, do you diminish their achievements? What's your responsibility as a person reporting or rewriting this person?
That's really interesting. I think it's to find the gaps for sure. To fill those gaps. And to see what kinds of ways in which one could benefit from that knowledge in the contemporary period. And particularly with people like her who were erased. Because keep in mind, when she was deported, right, and sent to London, the idea was to really have you be forgotten about. And that actually happened. Because until I went back and did that work, she was technically removed from the place. And that's why in this Left of Karl Marx, I talk about the whole question about deporting the radical black subject, so that in many ways, deporting her at the point of time that they did is a way of deporting the radical black subject to an elsewhere, where you're no longer existing and so on, and therefore you're doing other things. So she goes to London, and then she's still, although she's still in the Communist Party, the CPGB, she runs into the British version of racism, which is interestingly, when she was in the US, she was part of a cadre of people who had already pushed back against a lot of that. So now she's alone in England, trying to find a way. And a couple older comrades of hers that I met said that she would say, well, they act like they had no idea who she was. And acted like if she was of no value at the time. So she said to one woman who told me that, she said, as far as they're concerned, I might as well be dead because they haven't really engaged me. So it's at this point she shifts completely and works for black community.
I see. So I'm going to ask my last question so that we allow these guys to say something. You said something interesting about how women organize. And a little earlier we talked about labor and how important that question was to the ideas of Claudia Jones. Now, in the last couple of years in Kenya, these two issues, labor and femicide, have been big in our moral economy as the things that we argue about on social media, at a political front. And the labor thing, if I can just draw that out a little bit, is we have a government now whose policy on creating jobs is about sending people abroad to Saudi Arabia, to Germany. The president tells us all the time, I have found 350,000 jobs for Kenyans in XYZ. And the idea is they go and work abroad, and then the government makes money from the money that they send home, reparations,
Definitely
remittances which are taxed. So the labor question in that sense, and there's a question around how governments value populations and also think about disposable populations. But the other question, speaking of disposable populations, is a question of femicide. And there was a march, I don't know that you read about this, but there was a march in Nairobi, actually in many cities, in many towns in Kenya not too long ago, which was simply around the question of stop murdering women. Is there anything that we can gain from the ideas of Claudia Jones around, number one, the labor question, but number two, femicide?
Well, definitely the labor question, as we've talked about earlier. And she didn't, I think at that point in time, she was not engaging in the language that would be equivalent to what we use now.
Yes.
But really trying to understand how women's lives are affected. So this is why she has, and Buzz Johnson used, I think of my mother, because at the time her mother died at like 32 years old. And she died from working in those factories in the U.S. in New York. And from back in that period, the research shows they would like lock the doors And those women had to work so hard doing piecework, labor, speed up work, they called it, where you had to really be fast on those machines. And for her mother died from overwork. And she was a young girl at the time, so she always felt that her mother's demise and the way that her body and her physical life was exploited was directly linked to the question of women's labor and exploitation. And there's a couple other interesting conjunctions there too. At that time, there was a really interesting research project called the Bronx Slave Market, where white women, Jewish women from more suburban, middle-class-ish kind of families would go down they would go down to particular street corners in Brooklyn and Harlem and get a woman to come and work in the house for the whole day. But that whole day's work was often a whole week's work, because they would try to extract all the labor they could get from them. So that's why it was called, and it's worth looking it up. You can find it online, the Bronx Slave Market, by a woman named Marvell Cook. And I think in many ways Claudia Jones was trying to find ways to understand those, the ways that those two things were coming together. And she knew those women, and they worked. But back to the question about the hero, one of the points I want to make, though, and there's a really cool young scholar named Cherise Burton-Stelly, and she did a book recently called Organized Fight Win, and that's worth getting if you don't have it here. Some of you have seen you shaking your head. But basically in there, she talks about the ways in which a number of women who surrounded Claudia were doing similar kind of work. But we have the assumption that, we just know them one or the two. And the kind of work that a lot of young scholars are doing, I love, because they're going back now and back to telling those stories of who those women were and what kind of work they did along the way. So that Organized Fight Win is a really good place to look, because it's not just Claudia, there's several other people who were doing that kind of intellectual work, and intellectual and activist work at the time, thinking through that conjunction of women and labor, black women and labor, and how those two things were coming together to the detriment of black women. Labor in the workforce, and then of course labor at home as well, to help your children, make it through the next day.
And that, I think that's a valuable thing, very valuable thing for us. I'm just thinking, as you were speaking, I thought this is interesting, because one of the other things that we must add to our conversation around femicide is the many other ways in which women are being killed from the point of view of labor, right? So, thank you for that.
I was trying to find the title for it, the full title, but I have it here somewhere.
Okay. So, gentlemen, we've talked
is it 40 minutes already?
It's 40 minutes for sure. So, gentlemen, we've talked a lot as women. Maybe you want to say something. The women are allowed to talk as well. So please, as you ask your question, it will help if you can just give us your name, but maybe a round of applause first.
I still disagree with her. I don't believe you should ever call men to speak.
Yeah.
Because they usually take over the whole thing. And then you have to try to make them sit down.
Yeah, okay, so the gentleman will speak last. Okay.
Right.
Questions.
Questions.
Anybody?
Comments.
I see a hand at the back. Do we have a mic? No, I'll be able to. You're loud? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been so interesting.
You didn't tell us your name. Please start there.
My name is McKenna. I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been so interesting and really inspiring. And my question was around your career in academia and how that influenced your capacity to write and do the work that you've been able to do, because a lot of black women are being pushed out of academia now. It's always happened, but it's just recently, as things have become more expensive, they're less paid, the racism that they go through, it's harder to create that work. So yes, from your point of view, how did being in academia support you to be able, or not, to be able to create the work that you created? And do you think that the way in which black women are being pushed out of academia now is part of ensuring that people forget about black radical movements?
Okay, I think, how can I say that? I'm not sure if it's your your analysis is consistent every other place. So that's why I wish you would probably explain a little bit more about, you're talking about in Kenya that that's happening?
Generally, I'm just, okay, it is a generalization, but my experience from seeing my friends, my black female friends who went into academia to, and have been pushed out very quickly, just because of they made it very difficult for them to live and work and create in academia. And I was wondering if there's a connection with them, with academia not wanting, the academy not wanting to create radical work. And if the academy was, being in the academy was in any way influential towards you being able to create the body of work you've been able to create.
Right. Well, a couple of things I would say about that. Well, for me, and at least based in the US and coming from the Caribbean, a lot of the intellectual work is being done by young women, young black women. That's who is really doing that work. So I'm surprised that they're being pushed out in Kenya, and you all need to push back against that as well, and if that's the case. But in my case, and this is why I said I came into the academy at a time when things were opening up. And sometimes they close up as well, as we know. But things were opening up in the sense that you had the institutions having to hire black people to teach at universities after, the various political movements that demanded those things happen, right, to integrate and so on. So you end up having more and more people doing that. Now, interestingly, in my case, I was trained, I went to school in the United States, and then I got a Commonwealth scholarship to go to Nigeria to study African literature. And then, having done that, I had to be assigned back to Trinidad to pay for the scholarship. They take back the time that you go there. But when I went back, I was assigned to a teacher's college. So I was teaching in the teacher's college, and it was quite demanding in a sense, because I remember, in a way, it helped me learn how to teach, because you would often be teaching a class of like 250 people in a big room with no microphone, and you had to talk all the way to reach all the way back to the last person. But then I was just coming back with a PhD, something like 28 years old, and trying to have a level of influence that I could have with people sometimes older than me and so on. And because I had a US residency and all of that, I was able to, I went back to the US after working in Trinidad in that teacher education field. Which interestingly, I'd come back with a degree in Ibadan, having studied African literature, and they wanted me to teach British literatures. So that was one of the most frustrating parts of it, really, honestly. And I was, they were having you teach the British canon and so on. So then I said to myself, when I went back to the US one summer, if I get hired, I will just stay. And I did. That was amazing. So that's how I ended up being in the US Academy, although coming from Trinidad and so on. But I never lost my connections in terms of going back and forth. But the point is that I come in at a time when the universities are opening up and hiring people. And then at the same time, you have, the leftover remains of Black Power activism. But then I came in at the exact time where you have the rise of a Black feminist movement. With Combahee River Collective people and all that, demanding curricula that would be more expansive, that would include women's work and so on. So that's how I ended up doing the first book you mentioned, because Studies of Women in African Literature, because we would go to conferences and in African Literature Association conferences, and they would only talk about the male writers. And the few of us who were bold enough to do anything on women, the men would try to shut us down. Yeah, and they would say all this woman stuff, it's not useful. So it's actually out of that, including, you all need to know this, Haile Gerima. You all know Haile? Yeah. He was part of a group that stood up and told us, you all have no theory, you all have no nothing. What do you have? He really did. And I don't know if he remembers that, but I have to catch him one day on that one. And we would be always trying to present in the face of all this stuff. And African men telling us African women don't need any of this woman stuff because, that's a white woman thing. They're already liberated and so on. So we're always pushing back against that. So actually that Nambika comes out of that because the women who were part of that group who presented papers at those conferences, we eventually needed to find a place where we could assemble all of them, and that's how that came about. And of course, we were fortunate to have people like Miss Sherry around, right? And that's what I meant about mentioning her at the start, because she was part of that, yeah, exactly, that group of women who was also pushing back at the same things in this context here as well. So they couldn't say then that this is completely a Western import that we are trying to put on African women who don't need any liberation, they're already liberated and so on. So that was always the little tension, but we were fortunate to have a number of women who were continental African women who were often asserting in different ways the logics of African women, asserting not identical, of course, feminist claims, but claims that have to do with how women see themselves in the world and how they're positioned. So feminist movement was really significant to many of us, giving us the space to do that kind of work. Yeah.
So now it starts. So what I'm going to do, let me just stand up so that I can see. I'm going to start from this end and just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the conversation. My name is Seth Usani. And speaking on Claudia Jones, who was a very staunch communist, we see a lot of the organizations, communists and a journalist as well. And we're seeing a lot of the organization of communists and socialists, not just across the globe, but especially for the state of the global south. And this is happening, of course, through the anti-imperialism, but also through journalism and the information that is getting out there. Also, for the women, especially in the communist and political parties that are socialist, there is still a lot of male domination. So from the documentation, thankfully, that you're doing of these women and many other women who are in communist organizations, how do we ensure that, one, we are not deorganized as communist and socialist organizations, that we keep together, and two, how do we ensure that the women collective, especially in these political parties, keep together and we have that 50% representation?
Shall we take 3 minutes?
Yeah, maybe, yeah, that would be good.
John, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm John Dabula from Morana University, and thank you for coming to speak to our students at the university. Now, you talked about your movement and the kind of impetus you gave the African writing earlier on by including new writers like Ama Ata Aidu and so on. And now from your position, because I understand now you're in the chair of the department now, what kind of efforts are we continuing to bring in young women who are writing maybe from the margins, new kinds of writing, online journals and so on, or we're still stuck with the Ama Ata Aidus of the past? Thank you.
And the third one, somewhere here. Yeah, please stand up.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Rachel, and I really want to unpack the question around patriarchy within the movement, and especially when we are giving the clarity of Claudia Jones in terms of even like, let's say, the women role within the movement, and also following up on my sister's question, to what level also with the current states of growing of anti-gender, anti-choice movement. Unfortunately, also seeing some of our male comrades also claim they are Pan-Africanists, but also becoming homophobic, becoming patriarchal. So at what level do we sit down and say, yes, we are fighting for that rights, but at the same time, protecting the movements, but also asking accountability question. That's one. Secondly, around femicides, my colleagues and I and others that are not here were in the forefront organizing that march. Because I feel, in terms of also the lessons that you mentioned of Claudia, and also communists, that even as us as black feminists, we have been in the forefront fighting even extrajudicial killings. But the reality is there's a betrayal that the movement that we fight and support, even now with the current femicide case, they're not with us. They're not supporting us, there's no solidarity. They are left alone. So to what level do we ensure that we sustain the movement, but at the same time we are there to work with each other authentically, with solidarity, with love and care, but also with accountability expressions.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, the thing is, I believe organizations you don't have to really be locked into an oppressive organization, that one has to find alternative pathways all the time. And invariably, sometimes even a small group of people can, without having a lot of the support external, can do a lot of work without you knowing it. So that's, I would say do not stay in oppressive organizations where they're trying to shut you down all the time. You don't really need that, because you leave so demoralized by the time you go home every time. So instead, I work with people who are thinking similarly or have similar agendas, so that you actually have a good organizing platform that is worthy and caring of what you're doing, as opposed to just putting your energy into organizations that really don't care about it. And then find the men who are able to be supportive, because you have brothers who understand the questions that you're raising and have to be also, brought to knowledge sometimes and willing, hopefully they'll be willing to, they're part of that organization, be willing to learn what are the key issues that women are working through in those particular groups. But I was looking at trying to find what the organized fight when women did. What some of them did was try to find analyses in terms of what the oppressive conditions were, and then try to build movements based on that, and then proposing strategies for organizing and around those particular issues. So in other words, finding what the particular issues are that are so critical in a particular situation, and working hard to find ways to develop strategies to combat them. I don't know what else to say beyond that. The Amataidus, you would be surprised that even that generation is sometimes still hard to make sure that they're represented. So that's the other part of it. Even people like Michere. And her last book is really good because she really spent time outlining all of her intellectual positions herself, and therefore publishing some of her thoughts along the way, along that. So the point about being stuck with that group is not even a way to see it, because they're often not part of the general discussion. And we are the ones who've found ways to bring back the works like Amata do to be considered. It's only like Amata died, as you know, within a month of Michere, the other way around. And when I went to a funeral in Ghana, and it was at the funeral where they were saying so many wonderful things about her. And we were imagining, my friends and I who were there, that if she were present, she would get up and tell them, really? All the time I was alive, you all didn't give a damn about me, and now I'm dead, you're talking all this wonderful stuff about me, about how wonderful I am, and so on. So, in other words, it's a continued struggle to reinsert all the time analyses that will be balanced and fair and make sure we're covering the literature. Because again, back to half the world, if we're talking about literature, right? And we're looking at analyses of what particular issues that are being raised by writers, are we going to get the full picture with only one gender? Or are we going to look at the full range of representations and issues that are raised by a range of different type of writers and positions as well? Yeah. Right.
So when we talk about the canon, we talk about dead white men, and that we've studied them enough. You're saying that we haven't studied dead black women enough.
Yeah, I guess we can phrase it like that.
Okay, no, yeah.
But she's working on questions of cemeteries and mournings. That's why she phrase it like that. So I don't think you mean the dead white women.
Yeah.
Dead black women. I almost said dead white women.
Yeah. And I guess the challenge for us, and John, I really like that question, the challenge for us is really, how do we do both and? It doesn't have to be either or.
Exactly.
So that at the same time as we're expanding the space to understand the dead black women more, we're also paying attention to all of the vibrant young women who are writing. I think it's possible to do both. And I think
Absolutely.
that's a challenge for those of you who are in the classroom, and those of us who are producing ideas outside the classroom. Also
Yeah,
just
my
find
position
ways
is
to
the field
continue it.
expands in both directions,
Yeah.
reclaiming and then
Yeah.
adding,
Yeah.
so that you have a full spectrum
Of
of representation.
everything, yeah.
I was going to say, though, in answer to the other question, I noticed the flyer when it went out talked about the right to be radical, because that's one of the things that Claudia asserted, that, you know, we have a right to be radical. And radical meaning pushing against the status quo positions that remain the given, you know, positions that we should be at. And she was doing that all the time, you know, pushing back against whatever the status quo was in organizations, in a larger society, and so on. But the punishments are real. I mean, she was incarcerated 3 times. She was deported, you know. So the point is that a lot of that work doesn't come without sometimes negative repercussions from states, from colleagues, from whatever. So one has to assume often that you're in a danger zone sometime, and how to respond to not be caught in its tentacles, if you will. Yeah.
So a few more questions. I think there was one question.
There was one
there
in
at
the
back.
front.
So what we're going to do is we're going to do a
Yeah.
1, 2, and 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let me have a. Yeah, you start, and then. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
She's hiding on the back.
We'll get to you. Let's start with that corner there. There was a gentleman who wanted to say something. But Mheshimiwa, you will be last.
That's justice for Mheshimiwa to last.
It is, right?
It is right.
Yeah.
My name is Cheche. I really appreciate Prof. Those so very inspiring. I've been reading about Caribbean writers for many years, and I have never met one. I always read in the books. So I'm very honored to meet you. About C.R. James Walter Mosley. I've read about your article introduction, and that's the question I want to ask. But I did just make a comment that the homage you paid to Michelle Book was very powerful. And we really respect, and you know much more about the role of Michelle as an intellectual who never compromised and paid a heavy price.
Exactly.
And I don't think now, in the bourgeois university, you will find a professor who is willing to pay a price. I've not met one. We have been a major crisis now. How many books are outside there discussing about the liberal forces, all about AMF, yeah? The role of the machine we are doing in parliament. Yeah? You can't find a book where Mugi was young and many other Michelle is right. Our university is so boring. Claudia Jones was not a university, so why it was powerful?
And your question, Rashin, is?
I just want to comment that because many people want to be comfortable in the book university. But my question is,
Thank you.
when did you write that introduction of Walter Rodney, a book, Drowning with My Brothers, and why did you write about the role of education?
Wow, that's good.
So
Yeah.
we'll keep the questions short so that we include as many people as possible. I think you had your hand up. Yes, you.
Yes, Lizzie, actually, I wanted to ask about your connection with Claudia in terms of your Trini heritage, and I know you said she left when she was only 8, but was there a radical feminist element of that upbringing, or that her mother carried with her to America, which you think informed who she became in terms of being an outspoken, educated person who saw herself as valid and equal? Like, and is that something you share? Does that come from Trinidad, or is that something else?
Okay, and then against the wall there, so that we'll come back to the pillars after she answers, yeah? So the two ladies there.
My name is Sophia Sharia. Prof, thank you so much. You saved me through that. You saved my life. I read everything when I was writing my thesis on female rights and objectives now past grace of God. You saved my life. I won't say much about your new book because I haven't read it, and I shy to talk about things that I haven't read. But I will pick something that you said about labor, fighting for labor, and so forth. I just want you to comment on 3 things, 3 words, in whichever order that you want them to be: labor, remuneration, irrespective. Just to confirm. Because
Labor irrespective.
wherever you are, there will be need for labor. And by our DNA, we labor through our children. And we labor through our lives throughout. So if you're talking about labor remuneration, irrespective of women, what would you say? Thank you.
And the final one for this round, please.
I'll stand up because my voice does not project very well when I'm seated. And Professor, it's really good to meet you again. I was one of the privileged women to meet you on Monday, and therefore I have had the privilege of reading through your latest book which you brought. Everybody, it's called Black Women's Rights, Leadership and the Circularities of Power. And you look at women in political leadership in this book. And so my question is actually around women in political leadership. It's a question about power. And what I'm going to ask you is that, looking at your trajectory, you have looked at women in different spaces through fiction and all that. This might not be ultimate, but for now, you end on women in political power. And so the question I was going to ask you was Kwame Nkrumah right all along when he said that we should seek first the political kingdom?
Oh wow! I thought you were going to ask a different Kwame. Yeah, that's funny. Trinidad has I was at the risk of being nationalistic, which is so easy for Trinidadians and Jamaicans and all the other islands to do. But Trinidad has produced a formidable number of Pan-Africanists, and that would probably tie in with my colleague back there. And from the first one, right, Sylvester Williams and that first Pan-African Conference, 1900, Trinidadian lawyer, and looking always at not just talking about the black experience in the local Caribbean sense, but always looking outward at the global as well. And that Pan-Africanism is, in its essence, a kind of global philosophy. So Sylvester Williams, and then, of course, Padmore, we have James. I mean, you can just go down the list. And interestingly, in Trinidad, what was fascinating for me is that when, the Afrocentric brothers, when they would do libations, like opening every event, they would have these libations. Let's pour libation for Kwame. Let's pour for... it's always all men. And we push them, so now when they do it, they add Claudia Jones to it. So now they Babalawo, Claudia Jones. So I think the conjunction of location, Trinidad is sitting right next to Venezuela, so the currents from Latin America as well, and then of course the political legacies that come from history and slavery and so on. I love the fact that C.L.R. James said in The Black Jacobins that whenever we do any of these analyses, we have to look at not the actors themselves, but the conditions that created them to respond to them. So that's why you have a Haitian revolution, that the actual oppressive conditions, lead to the ways in which those political actors then respond. So the core then of all of those intellectual movements come from people pushing back against ways in which the larger culture was erasing them. So the being brought from Africa as enslaved people and being put on an island and then having to deal with the 300 years of enslavement, one always has then that fire inside of resistance in different kinds of ways. And it comes out in the carnival. I mean, there's a whole, which is happening right now. And in fact, I have a friend who's a performance dramatist, artist, and she has created a whole opening ceremony to carnival called Can Brûlé Festival. Can Brûlé means burnt cane, and all it has, Can Brûlé is patois Creole for Can Brûlé, but it's called Can Brûlé, and it's actually a documentation of how Carnival actually is a response. It's actually a political response to oppression. So the enslaved then began to make fun of the masters who were having balls and so on, and then they took it to the street and added all the various African components to it. So she does a whole opening ceremony of Carnival using that Can Brûlé, explaining the whole history of how Carnival starts actually, not from the French, but from the African side of things. So that ongoing resistance then, which is built into the oppressive structure, then is what guides, and it comes out to me also in the intellectual work, but also in the performative, and in a whole host of other ways. And I think because of that, your point is about the truthiness of that. Because of that, you have then a kind of built-in resistance. The other thing people say is because Trinidad had so many different colonial owners, and often there were more, and this is the position of Earl Lovelace, you have more, you have less managers, if you will, as opposed to the US context where you have this plantation system that was so entrenched. The Trinidadians were often on their own. They could do whatever they wanted, so they resisted the full control of the dominant structures, unlike some other places, like Barbados, for example, where you have the start of that slave economy using sugar and using all the punitive factors, which actually goes then north to South Carolina and creates a whole other plantation system there as well. So I think, you know, the things you have to look at each island in terms of its location, its relation geographically to certain spaces, and then the various intellectual currents. But the other thing, Lizzie, that's really important, you would have a number of leftist intellectuals who would go to the Caribbean and teach as well. So Sheila James talks about that, being in class with British leftists, who came down to the Caribbean to teach, and actually brought some of the different kinds of knowledge patterns to some of the young students that then they would use and then recreate in their own way as they move out into the world. So James is really interesting for that, and that was the question about groundlings with my brothers and Walter Rodney, because James then impacts so many others. James is the one who actually has Eric Williams pursue that capitalism and slavery as his dissertation. Because Williams was brilliant, he was a historian, but James, who was older than him and a teacher to him, encouraged him to work on that capitalism and slavery project, which is really quite radical and progressive and so on. And often people compare that with Williams's practice later on as a prime minister, which ends up a little bit different. But capitalism and slavery and that really amazing thesis, but also impacted people like Walter Rodney, who would be part of his circle and be able to learn different kinds of approaches to studying African history. So in the Groundlings with My Brothers, what Walter did, and it's really based on the speeches he would come back to Jamaica and teach to the Rastafari brethren who would come and learn about African history. He was really spending time trying to let them understand that the negative information that we received about Africa would be challenged and corrected and give them that long history. So how Europe underdeveloped Africa is doing that work. And so it's saying that Africa had a developmental pattern all along that is then circumvented deliberately by the Europeans. And there's a new book by Hilary Beckles, How Britain Underdeveloped the Caribbean. That one is really worth looking at as well, because he has the documentation from people like Churchill and others, where they actually said that we need to exploit these Caribbean islands and send our workforce from England, our working class workforce, to these locations, so that therefore that whatever they acquire will make them less likely to be so rebellious in England. So that was a fascinating other thing that Beckles' work has been able to uncover by actually finding the memos where they talked about deliberately underdeveloping these locations. And this is why we were talking about this yesterday with Mukomo in Kenyatta University. When the British and the others left the Caribbean, particularly the British, they left nothing. They took what they wanted and they left nothing. So we have no love for that, royal colonial culture, which still wants to impose itself by sending the young versions to, like Harry or whoever, to come down to the Caribbean and have a good time and so on. Or us celebrating the passing of the various elders in their families. right, pretty much that's it. So it's a really interesting set of histories that we are beneficiaries of, and I think if we can find ways to really bring those together and understand. So always the logic of Africa has been central, because this sense of separation and being taken away from and how to recapture what that means without being overly romanticized or falling into the Garvey model, for example, has always been fundamentally part of a way of understanding ourselves in the world, really, you know, and understanding that we are in a particular location, but we're not only from that location. We have other kinds of relationships that we have to cultivate and develop all along the world. And the other question was 3 things about, I forgot.
It was labor.
Labor woman or whatever. Yeah. And I mean, I've talked about labor already in a certain kind of way. You know, I come to this, I'm a literary theorist more than I am, I'm sort of passing as somebody who knows all those other things. So I'm not an expert on labor. I won't even venture to say that I will testify that I can give you full analyses of all of that. But what I do know is the work that has been done on how women's labor is appropriated and exploited, and I can talk about that. So women and labor, multiply donations of self, living the gift always, you know, multiple ways in which our labor is extracted and used and not really recompensed. All of those things to me are really significant. But I'm happy that Nambika worked that way. Everywhere in Africa that I go, I was telling my friend that I was in South Africa at University of KwaZulu-Natal, and people brought Nambika. I'm like, that was since 1990. I sometimes forget when I wrote like this book, like, okay, 2007. So in a way, I'm happy that it has that value. And actually, people have told me that about the Caribbean book as well, out of the Kumbla. Especially in Canada, most of the grad students were like, you saved my life. Because when I went to my prof and said I wanted to work on women, and they said there are no women writers, then I had to bring them the book. But you all have to understand that in most universities, the professors would tell you what it is you're going to do your research on. And if you had a different idea, they would say, well, really, what is the research body of material that you can use? So a lot of young students, fortunately, were able to take some of those books and say, no, there's a whole body of material. But that's coming from what? Racism and sexism, isn't it? Because the assumption that we don't have writers, really, we don't have women writing, so that everybody else can write and we can't. So I was doing work on Brazil, right? And for the collection I did on internationalizing Black women's writing, Black women's diasporas, and I would go to Brazil. My part of it was looking at Brazilian women writers. And everywhere, Afro-Brazilian that is, and everywhere I would go and ask for Afro-Brazilian women writers, they would say they don't exist. Libraries, no. And they would bring me a Toni Morrison book. And, you know, so everywhere I went, libraries, bookshops, there were no Black Brazilian women writers, none. Until we got to Sao Paulo, and I met a woman named Miriam Alves, and she had a anthology in her hand, but no publisher, because she said these are Brazilian women writers. So what we have tried to do is to try to make space for some of that work to live. And hopefully, including this last book on leadership, the idea is not to claim we know everything about it, but to suggest this is an area that we have to study, because we see women coming to leadership, and we have to question them in the same way. Are they going to follow the same patterns of male-dominant leadership, or are they going to create other patterns in which they exercise, you know, their own use of power? And I said the other night again, and I will repeat, that it was horribly embarrassing that the one person to vote against the South African genocide claim was a Black woman. Totally embarrassing, especially when you have a really powerful South African Minister of International Relations who has been pushing the rights for Palestinians to have a way of living without being killed and their children being destroyed and so on. So, I mean, we have to look at their tendencies, because in the Caribbean as well, the person who was a prime minister and a woman was the person who let Ronald Reagan bring in the U.S. military as a place from which they could launch the destruction of Grenada, the Grenada Revolution. So, in other words, we're not idealizing women in power or saying that they're going to be better, but we're saying that we have to study them. We have a right also to have the space to be leaders, but we also have a right to, from on the other side, for people to analyze and study what their leadership pathways have been and what what they have done. And this was the sense of that book. And hopefully it will trigger a whole other field, I'm hoping, of women pursuing and interviewing after people leave office. Like we're talking about Obama today. What did he really achieve, right? Besides us feeling happy that he was the first black president of the United States. And the logic is that after the person leaves office, it should be a place where we also assess what they have done, what they have contributed, as opposed to letting them sort of go happily into retirement and do nothing else, right? Or to their presidential library.
The last round of questions. I said I wanted Mheshimiwa to be last. We can be very radical here. Mheshimiwa is a member of parliament. And,
really?
We're turning the tables.
I'm just saying my individual capacity.
I'm one of our most progressive leaders, I have to say. Shall we? This was the question here. So, behind the table. 1, 2, 3. Jockey, you can ask your question as you have a glass of water. So that Mheshimiwa can ask his. Is that fair, Jockey? Yeah? So 1, 2, 3, and then Mheshimiwa number 4. So, please tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Ukombozi, and I wanted to know your opinion about something. And you said that you prefer if we had 50-50 representation of women in parliament or in power. Well, Kenya, we did an experiment whereby we created specific roles in parliament for women. They're called women reps.
Women what?
Women representatives. Women reps.
Okay. And our experience in Kenya is that last year in November, Infotrack did a poll, and they asked Kenyans, what do you feel about our women reps? They said that the most ineffective people, and a lot of them want that position to be cancelled. And that's the experience with women in power. They haven't been able to accomplish much, despite having actual power. Now, when you look at the people who are trying to control women, it's not men in Kenya. There was a female governor who wanted to pass a law to stop women from riding on motorcycles because of the sitting positions. That's a woman. And then the other thing that you need to understand is
how patriarchy works.
Yeah. So, a lot of the women in power have been caught up in scandals, mostly sexual scandals. Over and over again.
Shall I save? Let him finish. Shall I save you from yourself?
I want to say something else. My last comment. A lot of times when discourse comes to Africa, they tend to blame quote-unquote African culture for the fate of the women. Yet when you consider in traditional African societies, women are considered equals and were never denied any opportunities. A good contrast is Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, women are treated like men. When you see the soldiers, 50% women. When you see people in construction sites actually carrying cement, 50% women. In Kenya, as a result of British colonialism, women were devalued immediately.
I can actually tell you about the deep femicide and domestic violence in Ethiopia, so you can't even talk. You need to cancel that question.
Do you agree? We cancel that?
Yes.
Yeah? Your last point, please.
It's the same.
But he's not asking a question, he's just making statements.
I'm asking a question.
What is the question?
What is your opinion about the endless condemnation of African culture, which is blamed for the consequences of European colonialism, femicide, and anti-woman culture?
Thank you. And your question was?
Mine's simpler. I like to think, my name is Tibi, I'm Ethiopian. I like to think about writing about people as developing a relationship with them that's really intimate. And I'm really interested in how we're changed by our relationships with other people. So my question for you is, how are you changed by writing this?
Oh wow, good question. Great question.
Thank you.
I love that.
There was one question that wasn't joking. Is that? Okay, sure, go ahead. 3. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so mine isn't a concept really, it's just a comment and I'll try to be brief.
And your name is?
Tina Bukanga from Tanzania. Yeah. So, And this connects to what some of the female comrades say about the patriarchal tendencies within our social movements, or rather the progressive organizations that we are involved in. And I'll connect this to how important the work of Comrade CBD is as far as bringing to life the work of the female comrades who struggled before us. Because oftentimes, whenever some patriarchal tendencies happen within our movements, and I'm speaking about my experience, whenever our comrades wanted to silence us, they would always come with the arguments like, you know, bringing gender issues here is so of imperialism and capitalist way of, you know, speaking of gender questions and so on and so forth. So at times it really challenged me to really go back and dig deep to find whether there were no female communist comrades. And that was the moment when I came across the Claudia Jones, you know, and other comrades. Started reading about the women's role in the Cuban Revolution and so on and so forth. So suppose such rich history of comrades like Claudia and the rest was not brought into life, like people like us really find nowhere to hang on whenever we wanted to build our argument that actually this is not about being in support of capitalism or imperialism. It's because these struggles need to go hand in hand. So you read about Comrade Claudia, who really positions the gender and the race issue within the larger struggle against capitalism and imperialism, and really, it really builds you, and help the way you grow ideologically within the movement, and you're able to counter such narratives from the progressive comrades within the movement. So thank you very much, Comrade CBD. Just like what she said, the book of Claudia Jones gave me a very great in fighting against patriarchal tendencies within the social movements.
Thank you. So yours was a comment, not a question.
Yeah.
And a very rich comment. Let's finish with Honorable Yusuf.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming over and enlightening us on the brilliant work, struggle, and thoughts of Claudia Jones. And I, as a person who has known Madam Professor Nyairo, who's worked with her in the political struggle, we're also touched by your kind tribute to her. And I just wanted to link up, you have answered the question that I probably wanted to know about Trinidad. What's it about Trinidad? But you have mentioned that, and I wanted to link that up with our own struggle. You know, we have been inspired by Henry Sylvester Williams, the Pan-Africanist, the father of Pan-Africanism. C.L.R. James has played a very big part in our struggle ourselves in Kenya here. He initiated, with your partner, he initiated and introduced Pan-Africanism to Jomo Kenyatta, our first president. And then he was also a major figure in the Caribbean people's struggle for the independence of Kenya with the Marxist struggle. C.L.R. James was in London. I had the opportunity also when we formed Kenya Umoja, Kenyan movement opposed to the current oil regime. He again was, even at that advanced stage, was with us up to the last meeting. So even used to come up sometimes to the protests that we used to in London. And then we have people like you, and we have many other Canadians, particularly from Trinidad. So I just wanted to ask, what is in the waters of Trinidad? So many brilliant and radical maybe
I was trying to find, you know, she did meet Jomo Kenyatta, Claudia Jones. It's in here, in the book.
London, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, today, the journalist, really lovely journalist, Jeff Koinange, when we met him, he found it right away. I was like, I must remember to mention that tonight.
Yeah.
And there was John LaRose.
John LaRose, right.
He was the chairman of our movement.
Okay. Yeah. So he was one of the people I interviewed when I was doing the book. Remember, I was saying, interviewing a number of people who helped her. He was definitely one of them. But she, you know, the point about Claudia is that she was right. Interestingly as well, her good friend was Amy Ashwood Garvey. Now, most people know about Marcus Garvey from, you know, the UNIA and the Back to Africa movement and so on. But his wife, Amy Ashwood, he had two wives, both named Amy. And I had such fun writing about this, actually. Because it's a little bit polygamous. Because the second Amy was when I talk about this in class, my students love it. It's like gossip. The second Amy was the maid of honor in the wedding. Right. So, right, there you go. So this is, what page is it?
235?
235, that's her photograph, Claudia with Jomo Kenyatta. She was positioned at a time in London when a lot of currents were taking place. So she was able then, when these people were coming through, she would meet them, hang out with them and stuff like that. And she's identified too in some research as having an impact on Nkrumah, as Kwame Nkrumah as well, when he was in his New York days and would move around the communists and various organizations and so on. So I don't know, the energies, I think, of all of those Pan-Africanists were always circular. They traveled many different places. But the point I was making about Amy Ashwood Garvey, she came to, in my current book, I have a nice section of work on her. She came to Africa. Marcus Garvey never was able to make it to Africa. But Amy Ashwood, the first wife, came to Liberia and then came to Ghana actually first and found her family. She was able to trace back her family from stories before Roots, you know, the famous Roots. Her stories her grandmother told her, because she was going through a period where, you know, young black women worried about how they looked and so on. And the father told her, you need to go talk to your grandmother. So she talked to the grandmother, who explained to her that where they came from and gave her all the names of villages and so on that she remembered hearing about that the family had come from. So because of this, she always had this sort of propensity towards Africa and trying to understand her relationship to that history. And in fact, when Marcus Garvey meets her, she's like 17 years old, I believe, or something like that. And she's holding her own at a debate. And he actually taps her to work with him. And actually, according to the research, she was a co-founder of that UNIA organization, but you don't get that. So she did found some of the women's wings, you know, the Black Horse Nurses and so on. But the Amy Ashwood Garvey then becomes a really close friend of Claudia. And she actually, Amy was also somebody who was very sexually liberated as well. And she had a number of relationships with some famous men. And I think she got Tubman in Liberia to help sponsor some of the work that people like Claudia were doing in London. So she was like one of the prime sponsors of the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News at its founding, which is Claudia's newspaper, which she founded 3 years after getting to London. Remember, she was deported in 1955. She arrives in London something like the 12th of December 1955 and gets medical checkups and so on. But then she has a newspaper going within 3 years. Because she had all that journalistic work from the Daily Worker, because in the Daily, and I have a whole chapter about that, as you know. In the Daily Worker, she moves up the ranks from being just a normal journalist to being an editor and so on. So she develops all her credentials as a journalist and then is able to use that now to found a newspaper, which in many ways, when I looked at the Daily Worker, the West Indian Gazette and Afro-Asian Caribbean News, it kind of follows the same format as the Daily Worker. So she has that influence structurally from them. And it's one of the first places that identified the independence of Ghana, and that she would have stories on Cuba, just, you know, so it becomes Pan-Africanist. And I want somebody really to do that work. Somebody needs to go and look at all those West Indian gazettes. I was trying to talk some grad students like Amandla, who was a journalist, to do that, but he's doing other things. But that's a whole unfinished area of study. In fact, all of these things that I'm talking about, people looking for projects, they're projects that you should be able to do just by thinking through. I was saying to the students at Moranga and at Kenyatta, there's so much work to be done. We shouldn't be, I wouldn't even entertain that limited debate about who did what when. Essentially, we have so much to do to make this world a better place that we don't have to really worry and fight about, trying to apportion blame for the conditions that we're in. We know what happened. We know the histories. We know the oppression. We know all of this documented, although now they're trying to erase them. So in my view, we should be doing all kinds of amazing work. There's so much more to be done, and I'm sure many of you in this room are engaged. That's why you're here.
But
otherwise, you would not come out.
This question here, how did this book change you?
Oh, how did it change me? It was almost, working on the Claudia work was almost spiritual, an amazing thing. Sometimes I'd be looking for something and I'd just find it. I talk about that in the introduction to it. And a lot of people like Alexis DeVoe, who worked on Audre Lorde, says the same thing, that when you really get into working into a life of a person, it's almost like a spiritual connection. Like they almost,
they speak through you.
Yeah, it's a strange thing that it's hard to speak about without experiencing it. But you do get, there's a kind of flow once you get into the place of doing it. So how it changed me, a couple of times, and I have to tell you, it's kind of embarrassing when people tell you that, but I was in a couple situations where people would say, what does she look like? She actually look like you. So, they said, they would say things like, well, she had a similar bearing, similar style, whatever. So that to me is a compliment, because I find her such a fascinatingly amazing woman. So how does it change me? It gives me more knowledge. I come to this project as a Black feminist literary critic, but I'm able then to add a lot more knowledge about those histories and about those periods. And I actually had to go back and do an international law degree, which I did, a master's in international law, to really do that deportation chapter and do it well.
You did the master's just for
Well, it was an unfinished thing that I always thought I should do. And it was around the same time, and I used the opportunity. It was a 1 year, it was very intense to be able to do it. But it also helped me in my more recent book as well. So because of the human rights portfolio of materials still have a lot to do with trying to find the rights of women to be represented in there, the rights of Black women in particular. The whole regime of human rights instruments often doesn't really capture what we need fully. So then you have secondary versions, like the Protocol of African Women's Rights and so on, which end up really, in fascinating ways, covering over some of the same territory that writers like Michere Mugo, writers like Amata Adu had been talking about years ago, about the rights of women. So it comes around, but it takes a long time. And to me, each of the additions that we can make to advancing those knowledge fields have value, and therefore they change us as we hope it changes others in the future.
Thank you. I think I want to bring this to a close. I think these words around how the knowledge changes us is a good note on which to end, right? Yeah. So two things. I will go away with your phrase about being brought to knowledge. It's really struck me. And it does happen very, very often that you find yourself in a place where somebody must hold you and take you to the knowledge that you need for you to get past that place. I don't want to talk about the nonsense I don't want to talk about what we're doing in Kenya right now, where we have a government that is about to send policemen to Haiti to fight the gangs there, which just means that the government needs to be brought to knowledge about that history and why that is such a bad idea. But we'll wash our dirty linen after you go home. But I will say this, that one of the things that and I'm so glad that you came, because this question around how do we, I think Ashihi asked this question, how do we reinvigorate the Kenyan University? I think one of the things that's become very evident from our conversation today is how a confluence of thinkers at a particular place at a particular time really moves big ideas quickly. It's wonderful how your books have changed how we think and write, and you've heard the evidence from the floor. It's powerful having you here. The great things that happened in the region in the 70s and the 60s. You know, you have people like Walter Rodney coming to Dar es Salaam, and how that invigorated ideas and shifted that. And maybe that's what we need more of to really move the Kenyan university. Absolutely. That we need to, it's not enough for us to be writing the books and hoping they circulate. It's also important for us to create melting pots every so often, sites and places where, you know, radical ideas can prosper, because the people who are gathered can actually do a lot to mentor and inspire and to think together. So at the end of the day, we are really talking about more and more how we are brought to knowledge. I love that phrase. I'm going to use it a lot. Thank you very much for tonight. Thank you, Cheche, for hosting. And thank you to our very engaged audience. Thank you very much. Come again, not just today.